It started as a mistake she kept replaying. Not the kind with a clear beginning. Not the kind that announces itself. More like a moment that slips into your body before your mind has time to refuse it. A pause that lasts a fraction too long. The feeling of being seen and not stepping away. She could still picture it, the quiet between two breaths. The way her fingers hovered near the edge of the desk instead of resting flat. The soft click of a door closing somewhere behind her, too distant to matter. Too close to ignore. Nothing happened. That was the problem. Nothing that could be named. Nothing that could be reported. Nothing that could be undone. Only the awareness. A strange, uninvited awareness. Of space. Of closeness. Of a presence that didn't press forward, didn't retreat either. Just stayed. She told herself it was nerves. A new environment. A long day. Simple explanations. Harmless ones. But explanations don't usually follow you home. They don't surface when you're alone in the dark. They don't make your chest feel tight for no reason at all. She found herself returning to a small, insignificant detail. The way a pen had been set down slowly. Not dropped. Not placed. Set. As if time had briefly softened around the gesture. It meant nothing. She knew that. And yet her body kept responding as if something delicate had been brushed, barely there. But impossible to forget. There was a boundary. She could sense it without being told. An invisible line drawn so cleanly almost felt safe. Almost. What unsettled her wasn't the line itself. It was how easily she could imagine stepping over it. Not today. Not consciously. But someday. Sooner than she wanted to admit. Thought arrived without shape. Without language. Just a quiet pressure. A sense that something had already shifted its weight. She hadn't planned to carry this moment with her. Hadn't planned to hold it the way you hold a fragile object you don't remember picking up. Careful. Secret. Uncertain where to put it. She stood very still, as if movement might cause the feeling to reveal its name. As if naming it would make it real. And if it became real, then nothing would be simple again. The air felt suspended. Not heavy. Not light. Waiting. As though a door had opened somewhere she couldn't see. As though she was already closer to something than she had ever intended to be. And the strangest part, she wasn't sure she wanted to move away. The elevator released her onto silence. Not the kind that felt peaceful. The kind that made her aware of her own breathing. Anne stood in front of the door with the frosted glass and the clean, unreadable lettering. Her badge felt suddenly heavier against her chest, as if it had turned into something that didn't belong to her. She adjusted the folder in her hands for the third time, then stopped because the movement was beginning to look like panic. Don't look like that. Her fingers found the corner of the folder again anyway. Thumb rubbing the paper edge back and forth, back and forth. A stupid little habit. The only proof she had a body. Behind her, somewhere down the corridor, a phone rang once, and then stopped. A printer hummed. Soft voices moved past the far end of the hallway without ever entering it, like the building itself knew this part of the floor was not for ordinary sound. Anne swallowed. She could still hear the rumor in the back of her mind, shaped like laughter she hadn't joined in on. The couch test. As if it was a joke. As if a woman's career could be reduced to a piece of furniture and a story people traded over lunches. Her gaze dropped, because looking at the door felt like looking at a cliff. She raised her hand. Paused. Her knuckles hovered a few inches from the glass. And then, before she touched it, the door opened. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. As if it had been waiting for her to decide. A woman stood there, framed by light that didn't look like it belonged to the hallway. The office behind her was all glass and dark wood and the kind of restraint that implied money without needing to say it. But it was the woman's stillness that made the space feel charged. Margaret Crown didn't smile. She didn't frown either. Her eyes moved over Anne with the precision of someone reading a document. Fast, exact and private. Anne felt her mouth open and close without sound for half a second. "Come in," Margaret said. Her voice wasn't soft. It wasn't harsh. It was controlled. As if every syllable had already been measured. Anne stepped forward. The door closed behind her with that same gentle finality. Click, like a decision. For a moment, there was nowhere to put her attention without feeling exposed. The office was too clean. Too arranged. Every object sat as if it had been instructed to do so. A wide desk that looked untouched. A wall of windows that made the city feel like a distant machine. A couch off to the side, gray, immaculate, positioned with such neutrality it almost felt innocent. Almost. Anne's pulse reacted to the sight of it anyway. She hated that her mind did that. Margaret walked back to the desk without hurrying, without inviting explanation. She didn't look back to check if Anne was following. She didn't have to. Her authority didn't need reinforcement. Anne stood where she was, still holding the folder. Still gripping it like a shield. Margaret sat, but not in the way people sat when they wanted someone to relax. She sat like someone settling into a role she never took off. One hand went to a pen, black lacquer, the kind that caught light, and she set it down slowly on the blotter. Sat out. Anne felt the smallest, strangest tightening in her chest, as if that quiet gesture had reached across the room and touched her. Margaret opened a file on her desk, eyes scanning. Then she looked up again. "You're early." Anne blinked. "Yes, I didn't want to be late. I don't mind early," Margaret said. A beat. "I mind I'm prepared." Anne's throat went tight. "I'm prepared." Margaret's gaze held her. Not unkind. Not warm. Just attentive. Anne shifted her weight, aware of the sound her shoes didn't make against the carpet. She felt too young in her own body. Too obvious. Like the freckles on her arms were shouting. She forced her hands to loosen around the folder. "I brought everything you asked for." Margaret's eyes flicked to the folder. "Put it on the desk." Anne moved. Each step felt louder than it should have. She placed the folder down carefully, trying not to let her fingers tremble. When she straightened, she realized she was too close. Close enough to smell something faint and expensive. Bergamot, maybe, with something darker underneath. Leather. Ink. A trace of smoke that wasn't actually smoke. She took a small step back. Margaret watched her do it. Anne felt heat in her face, sharp and unwelcome. Margaret lifted the folder, opened it, and began reading. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with the sound of paper turning, the soft scratch of the pen making a single mark, the distant movement of the city beyond the windows. Anne stood there like she had been placed on display. She tried to keep her face neutral, tried to keep her breathing steady. She told herself, this is an interview. This is professional. This is earned. And then her mind made the mistake of imagining what her coworkers would say if they could see her right now. Alone. Top floor. Her office. That couch. Anne's stomach tightened. Margaret looked up again. It. It wasn't a suggestion. Anne hesitated just long enough to hate herself for it. Her eyes moved to the couch. The couch that had become a story. She started toward the chair in front of the desk instead, because there was a chair, and chairs were safe. Margaret's gaze sharpened slightly, as if she'd noticed the direction of Anne's attention. "The chair," Margaret said, as though answering without being asked. Anne's lungs released a breath she hadn't realized she'd trapped. She sat, careful, posture straight. Folderless hands folded in her lap, fingers pressing too tightly together. Margaret leaned back a fraction. Not relaxed. Just recalibrated. Her eyes returned to the file, and when she spoke again, it was as if they were picking up a conversation that had started long before Anne arrived. "Your references were unusually consistent," Margaret said. "People exaggerate when they want something from you." They didn't exaggerate. Anne's mouth went dry. "Thank you." Margaret didn't acknowledge the thanks. "You've never worked in luxury?" "No, and yet you wrote a thesis on consumer identity and emotional attachment." Anne swallowed. "Yes." Margaret's pen tapped once against the desk. Not impatience. More like a habit. A signal to herself. Plain it. Anne's mind flashed blank for a second, panic blooming. Then the words arrived in a rush she had to control. "It's not about objects," she said, and then stopped, because she'd said it too quickly. She softened her tone. "I mean, people think it's about objects. But luxury is permission. It's ritual. It's a way to feel chosen." Margaret's gaze stayed on her face. It didn't drift. It didn't soften. Anne continued, slower now, grounding herself in the idea. "People don't buy a perfume because it smells good. They buy the story they can wear without speaking. They buy the version of themselves they want other people to believe in." Margaret's expression shifted so subtly Anne almost missed it. Not approval. Not disbelief. Recognition. Anne felt it like a small click inside her, like a lock turning. Margaret turned a page. Who taught you to think like that? Anne's heart stuttered. The question wasn't about her thesis anymore. It was about her. No one, she said, and then realized how arrogant that sounded. I mean, I read a lot. I pay attention. Margaret's eyes held hers. To what? Anne's fingers tightened together in her lap. She forced them apart. To people, she said. To what they're trying to hide. To what they're asking for without knowing how to ask. The silence that followed felt different. Thicker. Margaret set the pen down again, slowly, deliberately, and Anne hated that she noticed it. Hated the way her body reacted, as if the movement had meaning beyond a pen touching leather. Margaret stood, and Anne's spine straightened instinctively, as if her body understood a hierarchy even when her mind tried to pretend it didn't. Margaret walked to the window, hands behind her back. The city was below them, glittering and indifferent. From this height, everything looked clean. Everyone looked small. I've read your work, Margaret said without turning. Not just the polished version. Anne's stomach dropped. I read the notes, Margaret continued. The parts you crossed out. The parts you doubted. Anne's throat tightened, embarrassment and something sharper flooding her. That wasn't meant. It's not a criticism, Margaret said. It's a trait. Anne stared at the back of Margaret's blazer, at the clean line of her shoulders. The woman looked carved out of discipline. Not a single stray thread. Not a single unnecessary movement. Anne tried to speak. Nothing came out. Margaret turned then, finally facing her. And Anne saw it. An exhaustion so well controlled it almost passed as coldness. A kind of grief locked behind glass. The eyes of someone who had survived something that should have broken her and refused to let anyone see where it happened. Anne's chest tightened for an entirely different reason. She didn't know why that detail mattered to her. She didn't know why it made her want to be careful. Margaret walked back toward the desk. The distance between them closed and reopened, like a quiet test of gravity. When Margaret sat again, she didn't return to the file right away. She looked at Anne instead. Do you know why you're here? Anne's mouth felt dry. Because you saw potential. Margaret's gaze didn't change. That's what they told you. Anne hesitated. The wrong answer could cost her everything. The right answer felt like a trap. I'm here because you need someone, Anne said, and then felt her pulse spike as soon as the words left her. Too bold. Too direct. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. Anne forced herself not to look away. Her heart hammered, but her voice stayed steady. You need someone who can learn fast, who can carry responsibility without being loud about it. Someone who isn't tied to the usual networks. Margaret studied her for a long moment. Anne felt as if she was standing again, even though she was sitting. As if her entire body was on display. Margaret's voice lowered, not softer, but closer. And what do you think the cost is? Anne's breath caught. Cost. Careers destroyed. Reputations. The rumor that had followed her into this room like a shadow. Anne made herself answer anyway. The cost is that I don't get to make mistakes. Margaret's gaze held hers. Incorrect. Anne blinked. The cost, Margaret said, is that you don't get to be seen making them. Anne felt the words land in her body before she fully understood them. A small, cold weight. A warning wrapped in elegance. Margaret opened a drawer and removed a second folder, thinner, plain, unmarked. She slid it across the desk toward Anne. Anne didn't touch it immediately. She waited because the air felt too delicate. Margaret watched her. Take it. Anne's fingers reached out. The folder's surface felt oddly warm, as if it had been held recently. She pulled it closer, opened it. Inside was a schedule. A list of names. Private meetings. Training sessions. Travel dates that weren't dates yet, only possibilities. And at the bottom a single line. Confidential. Crown succession track. Anne's pulse thudded hard. This is a commitment, Margaret said. Anne looked up. To what? Margaret's eyes stayed on her, unblinking. To becoming someone who can run a part of this empire without needing anyone's permission. To learning how to hold power without letting it rot you from the inside. Anne's mouth went dry again. The language felt too intimate for business. Too personal. Like Margaret was describing a wound she recognized. Anne's fingers tightened on the paper. Why me? Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked down at Anne's hands, the way her thumb rubbed the corner of the page. Back and forth, back and forth. Anne froze, realizing she'd been doing it again. Margaret's gaze rose slowly to Anne's face. "Because you're afraid," she said, calm as weather. "And you came anyway." Anne felt heat crawl up her throat. "Everyone's afraid." Margaret's mouth shifted the smallest fraction. Not a smile. "Not quite." "No," Margaret said. "Most people are hungry. They confuse that with bravery." Anne's chest tightened. "And you don't?" Margaret's eyes flicked, just once, to the couch in the corner. It was nothing. It was everything. Anne felt her pulse react to the movement, to the implication her mind tried not to form. Margaret's voice remained controlled. "I don't have the luxury of confusing anything." Anne stared at her, caught between fear and something that felt like fascination. A question rose in her mind, circular and insistent. What does she want from me? Not professionally. Not on paper. From me. Anne pressed the folder shut as if closing it could close the thought. Margaret stood again, walking around the desk this time, coming closer than Anne expected. Anne's breath caught, subtle and betraying. Margaret stopped near the chair, not touching it, not touching Anne, just existing within the same air. Anne could smell her more clearly now. Bergamot, leather. Something metallic like cold rings warmed by skin. The scent made Anne's stomach tighten, and she hated herself for noticing it. Margaret's gaze dropped briefly to Anne's face, then to her hands again. "Your hands are shaking," Margaret said quietly. Anne's fingers stilled instantly, as if the words had turned her into marble. "They're not," Anne lied. Margaret didn't call it out. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached for the pen on the desk behind Anne and took it. Anne heard the soft click as Margaret twisted it open. Then, without asking, Margaret placed the pen in Anne's hand. Not touching her skin. Not directly. But close enough that Anne felt the heat of Margaret's fingers, a brush of air that shouldn't have mattered and did. Anne's breath hitched. She hated the sound of it. Margaret's voice came from just behind her shoulder. "Hold it correctly." Anne stared down at the pen, disoriented. Like this," Margaret said. Margaret's hand moved, still not touching Anne's, but guiding by proximity, by presence. Anne adjusted her grip, carefully, as if the pen was a fragile instrument. Margaret's breath, barely perceptible, warmed the air near Anne's hairline. Anne's body reacted before her mind gave permission. A tightening low in her abdomen. A sudden awareness of her own skin. No. Not that. Not exactly. Anne swallowed and forced her focus onto the pen, onto the simple physical instruction. The mundane made it worse. The mundanity made it feel intimate in a way that had no defense. Margaret stepped back. The space between them returned, but it didn't feel like relief. It felt like the moment had left an imprint. Margaret's voice returned to its earlier distance. "I'm not interested in rumors." Anne's heartbeat stumbled. I know you heard them," Margaret said. "People protect themselves by turning what they don't understand into something dirty." Anne's throat tightened. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to pretend she hadn't carried that rumor up here like a talisman. But Margaret's eyes held hers with something that felt like brutal honesty. Anne whispered, almost against her will, "Is it true?" The question hung there. Dangerous. Naked. Margaret didn't react with anger. She didn't react with amusement. She looked at Anne for a long moment, and the silence was so complete Anne could hear the distant hum of the building systems, the faint hiss of climate control. Then Margaret said, very evenly, "Do you want it to be?" Anne felt her entire body go still. Her mouth opened. Closed. She couldn't tell if it was a trap. She couldn't tell if it was a test. She couldn't tell if it was a warning. She could tell only one thing. The question had already changed something inside her. Anne's voice came out smaller than she wanted. "No." A beat. And then, because truth has a way of arriving late, she added, barely audible, "I don't know." Margaret's gaze didn't soften, but something in it shifted, like the slightest crack in ice. Like a recognition she hadn't asked for either. The pen in Anne's hand suddenly felt too heavy again. Margaret turned back toward the window, reclaiming distance as if distance was a rule she could enforce by moving. "Good," she said, and Anne couldn't tell if she meant the no or the I don't know. Outside, the city moved. Cars like bright insects. People like punctuation marks. Life continuing, indifferent to the small dangerous moment happening behind glass. Anne sat very still, the pen in her hand, the confidential folder on her lap. She tried to return to safety, to professionalism, to the idea that this was just a program, a schedule, a career path. But her body didn't believe her anymore. Her mind kept circling the same thought, returning to it like a tongue to a sore tooth. There's a boundary. There's a boundary. And she just asked if I wanted it crossed. And at Margaret's back, at the controlled line of her posture, at the way her hands clasped behind her as if holding herself together, Anne thought of the couch in the corner. Neutral, silent, innocent in appearance. Thought of how rumors were born from silence and proximity. Thought of how easily a life could be rewritten by someone else's version of the truth. And still, the part of her that should have been terrified felt something else underneath. A pull. A quiet, shameful curiosity. A sense that she had already stepped into a room she wouldn't exit the same way. Margaret spoke again without turning. Your first session is tomorrow morning. Anne's voice barely worked. Yes. Margaret paused, as if weighing something she didn't want to name. Then, still facing the window, she said, "Wear something you can breathe in." Anne's throat tightened. The words sounded like advice. They also sounded like foreknowledge. Anne looked down at the pen in her hand. The black lacquer caught the light. Her fingers, despite everything, had stopped shaking. Or maybe they were simply shaking differently now. Anne lifted her gaze back to Margaret's silhouette against the city. She should have felt grateful. She should have felt victorious. Instead, she felt as if she'd been handed something delicate and dangerous and told to carry it carefully, without being told what it was. And the worst part, the part she didn't know how to admit even to herself, was that she wasn't sure she wanted the rumor to be false anymore. Not because she wanted something vulgar, not because she wanted an easy story, but because something in Margaret's question had made a door appear in her mind. And now Anne couldn't stop hearing it. The quiet click, the sense of a boundary trembling, the possibility of stepping over it without knowing if she'd survive the fall. The second morning didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like something resuming. Anne noticed that before she noticed anything else. Not excitement. Not dread. Recognition. The elevator doors slid open, and the quiet was already waiting for her, exactly as it had the day before. Same soft hush. Same temperature that never quite belonged to a human body. Same sense that the air up here operated under a different set of rules. She stepped out. Her shoes made no sound. She hated that she had chosen them deliberately. Comfortable. Neutral. Something she could disappear inside. Wear something you can breathe in. The sentence had followed her into sleep. Not like a command. Not like a seduction. Like a piece of information. Anne adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, more to give her hand something to do than because it needed adjusting. She did not look at the door right away. She counted 3 slow breaths first. In. Out. In. Then she walked. This time she didn't hesitate before knocking. The door opened almost immediately. Margaret stood there in a charcoal blouse with the sleeves rolled just past her wrists. No jacket. No visible jewelry. Her hair pulled back in a low, unremarkable knot that somehow made her look more severe and more human at the same time. She looked at Anne. Not scanning. Not evaluating. Just looking. Anne felt it in her stomach before she found language for it. A small, quiet jolt. "You're on time," Margaret said. Anne nodded. "You said tomorrow morning." Margaret stepped aside. The invitation was wordless. Anne walked in. The office looked the same, which somehow mattered. Same clean surfaces. Same disciplined geometry. Same couch in the corner, unchanged and still too aware of itself. But something in the room felt subtly disturbed, like a glass of water, after a spoon has been set inside. Margaret closed the door. Click. Anne's shoulders lifted a fraction and then settled. Margaret didn't comment on it. "Coffee?" Margaret asked. The question felt ordinary. Anne blinked. "Yes, if that's okay." Margaret moved toward a side counter built into the wall. No assistant appeared. No call was made. Margaret handled the machine herself, as if the small task belonged to her and no one else. Anne watched without meaning to. The way Margaret measured grounds without looking. Practiced movement of her hands. The unhurried efficiency. It felt intimate in a way Anne didn't know how to explain. Not because it was personal. Because it was unguarded. Margaret set 2 cups on the counter. Black. No sugar. No questions. Anne noticed. She also noticed that she didn't correct it. Margaret handed her a cup. Their fingers didn't touch. Anne felt the absence of touch anyway. Sit, Margaret said, nodding toward the chair by the desk. Anne obeyed. Margaret sat across from her, not behind the desk this time, but at its corner, turning slightly so they were angled toward each other rather than separated by a full barrier. It was a small change. It felt enormous. They drank in silence. Anne told herself not to fill it. She failed. I looked at the schedule, Anne said. The one you gave me. Margaret nodded. And it's intense. Margaret's mouth curved almost imperceptibly. It's supposed to be. Anne hesitated. Some of the names, I recognize them. People who have been with the company a long time. Yes. So why me? The question slipped out before Anne could stop herself. Margaret's eyes held hers. You're still asking? Anne felt heat rise in her face. I'm trying to understand. Margaret took a slow sip of her coffee. Understanding is overrated, she said. Precision matters more. Anne frowned slightly. Precision about what? Margaret set her cup down. About who you are, she said. And who you are not. Anne didn't know how to answer that. So she didn't. The silence that followed felt different from yesterday's. Less brittle. Still dangerous. But not sharp. Margaret reached for a thin tablet on the desk and slid it toward Anne. Read. Anne took it. The document wasn't a policy. Not exactly. It was a case study. A failing luxury brand. Numbers. Consumer perception data. A brand story that had stopped working. Anne read. And as she read, something familiar began to happen inside her. The noise in her head quieted. The self-consciousness receded. She started to see patterns. Gaps. Tension between what the brand claimed to be and what people actually experienced. When she looked up, Margaret was watching her. Not her face. Her eyes. What do you see? Margaret asked. Anne inhaled. They're lying, she said. Margaret didn't react. Not deliberately, Anne added. But they're pretending their customer is someone she isn't anymore. They're selling nostalgia to people who are trying to escape it. Margaret's gaze sharpened slightly. Anne continued, words finding their rhythm. They need to stop talking about heritage and start talking about transformation. They need to make the customer feel like she's becoming something, not remembering something. Margaret's fingers rested loosely against the edge of the desk. Go on. Anne did. She forgot the couch. Forgot the rumor. Forgot her own age. Forgot who Margaret Crown was supposed to be. She talked about narrative elasticity. About emotional permission. About the danger of confusing tradition with stagnation. Margaret listened. Didn't interrupt. Didn't correct. Only asked occasional, precise questions that forced Anne to refine her thinking. It felt like being sharpened, not cut. Time passed. Anne didn't know how much. At some point, Margaret stood and moved to the whiteboard. She wrote one word. Desire, then beneath it. Control, then. Identity, she turned. Every luxury transaction, Margaret said, is an exchange of fear. Anne blinked. Margaret elaborated. Fear of being invisible. Fear of being ordinary. Fear of being trapped in a version of oneself that no longer fits. Anne felt something open in her chest. Yes, she said softly. Exactly. Margaret studied her. Anne became aware, slowly, of her own breathing, of the warmth in the room, of the fact that Margaret was closer now than she had been before. Not close, but closer. Margaret wrote another word. Power. She set the marker down. Power isn't volume, Margaret said. It's gravity. Anne swallowed. She didn't know why that sentence felt aimed at her. Margaret walked back toward the desk. As she passed Anne, her sleeve brushed the back of Anne's chair. It was nothing. It was unmistakable. Anne's spine went rigid. Her body reacted before her mind could create a narrative. A brief, electric awareness. Margaret didn't stop. Didn't acknowledge it. She sat again. Anne stared at the word power on the board. Her thoughts began to drift in slow, circular loops. This is normal. This is mentorship. This is dangerous. The three ideas existed at the same time. None canceled the others. Margaret picked up her coffee cup again. "You're quiet." Anne blinked. "I'm thinking about?" Anne hesitated. Then, because lying felt heavier than telling a partial truth, she said, "About whether I can actually do this." Margaret's gaze softened by a degree so small it was almost theoretical. "You wouldn't be here if you couldn't." Anne's stomach tightened. "That doesn't mean I won't fail." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "You will fail," she said. "You just won't fail publicly." Anne absorbed that. It felt like a promise. It also felt like a cage. They returned to the document. To numbers. To strategy. To language that lived safely inside the professional sphere. But something had shifted. Not in what they were doing. In how it felt to be doing it together. Anne became aware of Margaret's rhythms. The way she paused before asking a question. The way she looked at Anne when she didn't like an answer. The way she went very still when she did. Margaret became aware of Anne's. The way Anne chewed lightly on the inside of her cheek when she was thinking. The way she leaned forward without realizing it when she was engaged. The way her voice dropped when she was certain. Neither of them commented on any of it. They didn't need to. At one point, Anne reached for the tablet at the same time Margaret did. Their fingers brushed. Barely. A whisper of contact. Anne's breath caught. Margaret froze. Not dramatically. Just paused. For a fraction of a second, neither of them moved. The room felt suspended. Then Margaret withdrew her hand. Slowly. Anne pulled hers back too. No one apologized. No one acknowledged it. They continued. But Anne's pulse took several minutes to slow. Her body kept replaying the sensation. Warm. Brief. Real. She hated that it felt real. She hated that she wanted it to happen again. The session ended without a formal ending. Margaret closed the tablet. "That's enough for today," she said. Anne nodded. She stood. Margaret stood too. They faced each other across a small, polite distance. Anne didn't know what she was supposed to feel. Grateful. Intimidated. Proud. She felt all of it. And something else underneath. Something she didn't have language for yet. Margaret spoke first. "You did well." Anne's chest tightened. "Thank you." Margaret hesitated. "Just a beat." "Tomorrow," Margaret said, "we'll talk about Paris." Anne's pulse jumped. Paris. Margaret's gaze held hers. One of the houses there will eventually need new leadership. Anne's mouth went dry. "Oh." Margaret nodded once. Not a promise. Not a guarantee. Possibility. Anne gathered her bag. She moved toward the door. Her hand closed around the handle. She paused. Not because she planned to say anything. Because some part of her didn't want to leave yet. Margaret didn't tell her to stay. She didn't tell her to go. She simply watched. Anne opened the door. The hallway waited. Before stepping out, Anne glanced back. Margaret stood where she had been standing, unmoving, watching Anne as if committing something to memory. Anne felt it land in her body like a quiet mark. She left. The door closed. Click. Anne stood in the hallway, heart beating too fast, feeling as if she had walked out of a room that was already beginning to change her shape. Not dramatically. Not obviously. Subtly. Persistently. Like gravity, the third session felt normal. That unsettled Anne more than anything else. Not easier. Not lighter. Normal. She noticed it while waiting for the elevator doors to close, staring at her reflection in the polished metal. Her face didn't look different. Her eyes didn't look different. But something in the way she stood had shifted, almost imperceptibly. Less braced. More placed. The doors slid shut. She didn't check her phone. She didn't rehearse answers. She simply waited. When the elevator opened onto the top floor, her body already knew where to go. That, too, unsettled her. Margaret opened the door before Anne knocked. Not immediately. Not slowly. As if she had been mid-thought and simply decided to end it. "You're early," Margaret said. Anne blinked. By 3 minutes. Margaret stepped aside anyway. Anne entered. The office greeted her like a familiar room in someone else's house. Nothing had changed. Which meant something had. Margaret wasn't wearing a blazer today. Just a soft, dark sweater with a fine knit that looked expensive in the quiet way expensive things often do. The sleeves were pushed up slightly, exposing her forearms. Anne registered this. She hated that she registered it. Margaret noticed the direction of Anne's eyes. Didn't comment. "Coffee?" Margaret asked. Anne nodded. They did not discuss sugar. They did not discuss cream. Margaret handed her the cup. Their fingers did not touch. Again. Anne felt the almost touch anyway. They sat in the same positions as yesterday. Same angle. Same distance. Pattern forming. Margaret opened a folder. "This house in Paris," she said, "is unstable." Anne's attention snapped fully into place. Margaret slid a thin dossier across the desk. Anne took it. Inside were photos. A boutique with tall windows. An atelier floor filled with light. Models backstage. Fabric draped like liquid over mannequins. Margaret spoke while Anne looked. "The creative director is brilliant," Margaret said. "He's also erratic. Investors are nervous. Staff morale is inconsistent. Sales are flattening in markets that should be rising." Anne turned a page. "What do you want me to do?" Margaret met her gaze. "Tell me what everyone else is afraid to say." Anne felt a small, familiar tightening. The good kind. The kind that meant she was being trusted. She studied the data again. Numbers. Trends. Notes from internal interviews. She spoke slowly. "He's bored." Margaret's brow lifted a fraction. Anne continued. "Not creatively. Structurally. He doesn't feel contained by the role anymore. So he's destabilizing the environment to create friction." Margaret watched her carefully. Anne went on. "He needs a new arena, or he'll burn this one down." Silence. Not empty. Processing. Margaret nodded once. "That aligns with my read." The word "aligns" landed softly between them. Anne felt a strange warmth at the base of her throat. They worked. For nearly an hour. Not in a rush. Not in a frenzy. Margaret asked. Anne answered. Anne proposed. Margaret refined. Sometimes they disagreed. Quietly. Precisely. At one point, Anne frowned at a margin note. "I don't think this is honest." Margaret tilted her head. "Explain." "They're framing this as a leadership problem," Anne said. "But it's a systems problem. If you replace him without changing the structure, you'll just create a new version of the same mess." Margaret studied her. Then slowly, she smiled. Not with her mouth. With her eyes. It was so subtle Anne almost missed it. Almost. Anne's stomach flipped. Margaret looked back at the page. "Good," she said. "I was hoping you'd say that." Anne didn't trust herself to respond. They fell into another stretch of quiet work. Not awkward. Not charged. Not empty. Something in between. Anne became aware of small, stupid details. The way Margaret always capped her pen before setting it down. The way she reread Anne's handwritten notes even though she just heard them spoken. The way her gaze lingered half a second longer than necessary before moving away. Margaret became aware of Anne's too. The way Anne tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she was thinking. The way she leaned closer to the desk without realizing it. The way she pressed her lips together when she was uncertain. Neither of them mentioned any of it. At some point Margaret stood. Anne looked up automatically. "I need to take a call," Margaret said. 5 minutes. Anne nodded. "Okay." Margaret hesitated. "Not about leaving. About something else. You can stay," she added. "Or use the restroom down the hall." Anne shook her head. "I'll stay." Margaret nodded once. She walked to the far side of the office, answering her phone quietly. Anne remained seated. Alone. Not alone. Margaret's voice was low, controlled, not meant for Anne's ears. Anne did not try to listen. She also did not put in earbuds. She simply sat. She looked at the whiteboard. Desire, control, identity, power. The words felt heavier today. Not ominous. Personal. Anne realized she no longer felt like a visitor in this space. That realization landed gently. It also scared her. Margaret ended the call. She didn't apologize. She returned to her seat. "Where were we?" Margaret asked. Anne answered immediately. "Systems restructuring." Margaret's mouth curved slightly. They resumed. The work deepened. Not broader. Deeper. They circled the same problems from different angles, returned to the same ideas with refinement. Anne felt herself becoming more precise, more confident. Margaret noticed. "You're editing yourself less," Margaret said. Anne blinked. "That bad?" "No," Margaret said. "It means you're starting to trust your instincts." Anne swallowed. "That assumes they're worth trusting." Margaret's gaze held hers. "They are." The words were simple. They landed heavily. Anne felt something inside her loosen. Not dramatically. Not visibly. Like a knot easing one loop at a time. They worked another half hour. When Margaret finally closed the folder, Anne felt a small, irrational disappointment. "That's enough for today," Margaret said. Again. The same words. Anne stood. Margaret stood too. Same distance. Same strange awareness of space between bodies. Anne gathered her things. She didn't move immediately. Neither did Margaret. It wasn't a standoff. It wasn't a moment. It was just a pause. Anne broke it. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up," she said before she could stop herself. Margaret's brow furrowed slightly. "From what?" "From this." Anne gestured vaguely. "The office. The building. The situation." Margaret considered her. "This isn't a dream," she said. "It's a process." Anne nodded. Processes felt safer than dreams. Margaret spoke again. "You're adapting quickly." Anne shrugged. "I don't really know how else to be." Margaret studied her. "That's not true." Anne looked up. Margaret's voice was calm. "You choose how you move through rooms. You choose what parts of yourself you offer." Anne felt exposed in a way she didn't quite understand. "I don't feel like I'm choosing much," Anne admitted. Margaret's gaze softened by a degree. "You are," she said. "You just don't see it yet." Silence settled. Not heavy. Not light. Suspended. Anne felt an urge to ask something. Not about work. Not about Paris. About Margaret. About the woman beneath the controlled surface. She didn't. Margaret seemed to sense it anyway. Her eyes flicked briefly to Anne's face. Then away. "Tomorrow," Margaret said, "we'll look at Milan." Anne nodded. "Okay," Margaret added after a beat. "You can start bringing your own coffee if you prefer." Anne almost laughed. "Almost. I'm fine with what you make." Margaret's gaze lifted. Something unreadable passed through it. "Noted," Margaret said. Anne moved toward the door. Her hand closed around the handle. She paused. Not because she planned to say anything. Because she felt something press gently at the inside of her ribs. A question. A pull. Quiet wanting that didn't have a name yet. She didn't turn around. She opened the door. The hallway waited. Before stepping out, Anne heard Margaret speak. "Anne." Anne turned. Margaret stood where she had been. Not closer. Not farther. "Good work today," Margaret said. Anne nodded. "Thank you." Their eyes held. Just long enough to feel. Not long enough to justify. Anne stepped into the hallway. The door closed. Click. Anne stood there for a moment, heart beating steadily, evenly, and somehow differently than it had before. Not faster. Not slower. Aligned. She realized with quiet clarity that she was beginning to look forward to these sessions in a way that had nothing to do with ambition. That realization didn't feel explosive. It felt inevitable, which somehow felt worse. The first thing that changed was not between them. It was around them. Anne noticed it in pieces. A look held half a second too long when she stepped off the elevator. A sudden hush at the end of a hallway. Averted eyes that pretended not to see. No one said anything, which meant everything was being said. She told herself she was imagining it. She told herself that being singled out always creates a vacuum, and vacuums get filled with stories. Still, when she reached the top floor, her chest already felt tight. Margaret did not open the door immediately this time. Anne knocked. Waited. Counted 3 breaths. The door opened. Margaret looked composed, which somehow felt wrong. "You're late," Margaret said. Anne blinked. By 2 minutes. Margaret stepped aside anyway. The tone wasn't sharp, but it wasn't neutral either. Anne entered. The office felt colder. Not in temperature. In texture. Everything was exactly where it always was. Which meant something was not. They did not go for coffee. Anne waited. Margaret walked past the counter without stopping. Small omission. Loud. Sit, Margaret said. Anne obeyed. Margaret remained standing. She picked up a folder. Did not open it. Anne felt a quiet coil of unease in her stomach. Has anyone spoken to you? Margaret asked. Anne's breath caught. No. Margaret's gaze sharpened. Has anyone approached you? Anne swallowed. No. Margaret held her gaze, long enough to feel like a test. Then she looked away. They will, Margaret said. Anne's fingers curled slightly in her lap. About what? Margaret's jaw tightened. About you. Anne felt heat rise in her face. About us. The word slipped out before she could stop it. Silence. Not the useful kind. Not the working kind. The dangerous kind. Margaret did not correct her. That was answer enough. Anne's heart began to beat harder. I haven't said anything, Anne said quickly. To anyone. Ever. I know, Margaret said. Anne didn't know how she knew. She wasn't sure she wanted to ask. Margaret finally sat. Not at the corner of the desk. Behind it. Barrier restored. We need to adjust, Margaret said. The word landed with weight. Adjust how? Anne asked. Margaret opened the folder. Inside was not Paris. Not Milan. It was a personnel structure. New reporting lines. New project assignments. Anne scanned. Her name appeared. Not under Margaret anymore. 2 levels down. A lateral move on paper. A quiet exile in practice. Anne looked up slowly. You're removing me from the succession track. Margaret's expression didn't change. I'm moving you into a less visible lane? Anne's chest tightened. Because people are talking. Because people always talk, Margaret said. This simply gives them less to work with. Anne stared at the page. The words blurred slightly. This feels like punishment. Margaret's voice stayed even. It's protection. Anne laughed once. A soft, broken sound she hadn't meant to make. From what? Margaret didn't answer immediately. Then, from becoming a liability. The word cut clean. Anne felt something fracture. Not explode. Not shatter. Crack. Small. Deep. I haven't done anything wrong, Anne said. Margaret met her gaze. Neither have I. Anne's mouth opened. Closed. That doesn't mean we're not vulnerable, Margaret added. The we did not feel reassuring. It felt heavy. You told me this was a commitment, Anne said quietly. You told me I was here because you saw something. I do, Margaret said. Then why does this feel like you're erasing me? Margaret's jaw tightened. I'm trying to keep you intact. Anne shook her head slowly. I didn't ask for this kind of intact. Margaret's eyes darkened. You don't get to choose the shape of safety in this building. Anne felt tears threaten. She hated that. She forced them back. Silence filled the space between them. Not thick. Not empty. Loaded. Margaret spoke first. There is an HR compliance review underway. Anne froze. A review of what? Of power dynamic. Anne's stomach dropped. They're investigating you. Margaret didn't answer. Which meant yes. Anne's hands curled into fists. Does the board know? Margaret hesitated. Yes. The room felt suddenly smaller. Anne whispered, Do they think? They don't have evidence, Margaret said. They have pattern recognition and boredom. Anne stared at her. Does anyone suspect me specifically? Margaret held her gaze. Not yet. The words did not comfort. Anne's voice came out thin. So I'm being hidden. Margaret did not deny it. Anne looked down at the personnel chart again. At her name. Lower. Quieter. Safer. She felt something inside her recoil. I worked for this, Anne said. I didn't sleep. I didn't socialize. I didn't breathe for anything else. Margaret's voice softened slightly. I know, you said I wouldn't fail publicly. Margaret's gaze flicked away. Anne felt a sharp, bitter ache. So privately is acceptable. Margaret looked back at her. This is not failure. It feels like it, Anne said. Silence. Margaret stood. She walked around the desk. Not quickly. Not slowly. She stopped in front of Anne. Not touching. Not leaning. Close enough that Anne could smell her again. Leather. Something metallic. Something restrained. Margaret spoke quietly. "This building eats people," she said. "Not the weak ones. The visible ones." Anne looked up at her. Margaret's eyes held something Anne had never seen there before. Fear. Controlled. But real. "I will not let it eat you," Margaret said. Anne's throat tightened painfully. "I don't want to be saved like this." Margaret's voice lowered further. "There are worse ways to be saved." Anne felt heat rise behind her eyes. She did not cry. She did not move. She whispered, "Is this really about protection?" Margaret's jaw flexed. "Yes." "A beat." "And about control," Margaret added. Anne's breath caught. "Yours or mine?" Margaret did not answer. The space between them felt charged in a different way now. Not possibility. Cost. Doubt. Margaret stepped back. The distance returned. It did not repair anything. "We're not meeting like this for a while," Margaret said. Anne felt the words hit her body before her mind processed them. "What does that mean?" "It means our sessions will be restructured. Group formats. Rotational mentorship." Anne stared. "You're ending it." Margaret's voice stayed steady. "I'm containing it." Anne felt hollow. "Does the board know about this change?" "Yes, so they win." Margaret's eyes hardened. "No, we survive." Anne shook her head slowly. "I didn't agree to survive like this." Margaret looked at her. "Long. Hard." She said, "You don't get to decide this alone." Anne's voice cracked. "Neither do you." Silence. Not useful. Not productive. Alive. Margaret spoke again, more quietly. "Nothing has to change between us." Anne laughed again. A brittle sound. "Everything has changed." Margaret did not argue. Anne stood. Her legs felt unsteady. She gathered her bag. Margaret remained where she was. They did not move toward each other. They did not move away either. Suspension. Anne turned toward the door. She stopped. Not because she had something prepared. Because something in her chest hurt too much to ignore. Without turning back, she said, "Was any of it real for you?" The question hovered. Margaret did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quiet. "Yes." Anne closed her eyes. That single word felt heavier than any denial could have. Anne opened the door. She did not look back. Not because she didn't want to. Because she wasn't sure she could leave if she did. The door began to close. Margaret spoke. "Anne." Anne froze. Hand on the handle. Margaret did not continue. Silence. A withheld sentence. A withheld choice. Anne waited. Margaret said nothing. Anne stepped into the hallway. The door closed. Click. Anne stood there, heart pounding, body tight, suspended between wanting to go back and knowing she shouldn't. And for the first time since she'd entered Crown Tower, she did not know which impulse would win. Anne did not go home. Not at first. She walked. No destination. No music. No phone in her hand. Just movement. The city existed around her like a separate organism, breathing, pulsing, unconcerned with the quiet rupture happening inside her chest. She crossed streets without noticing the lights. She passed cafes filled with people who looked intact. Whole. As if nothing had been rearranged. The word contained kept returning. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Like a dull echo. We're not ending it. We're containing it. Contained things don't disappear. They press. They warp their containers. Anne stopped at the edge of a small park she didn't remember choosing. Bare trees. Metal benches cold to the touch. She sat. Her hands shook now. Not violently. Just enough to be honest. She tried to think about logistics. About her new reporting line. About what she would say to her new manager. About how to look unbothered. Her mind refused. Instead, images surfaced. Margaret's hand hovering near hers. The way Margaret said her name. Not often. But deliberately. The word yes. One syllable. Heavy. Anne pressed her palms against her thighs. She didn't cry. Not yet. She felt hollow, like a room after furniture has been removed. Not empty. Echoing dot. Her phone vibrated. Once. Anne froze. She stared at it like it might explode. A text. Unknown number. She knew anyway. Margaret. Are you safe? Anne stared at the screen. The question was simple. It felt enormous. Safe from what? From the board? From rumors? From herself? Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She typed. Deleted. Typed again. Anne, I'm sitting in a park. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. Margaret, which one? Anne looked around. She didn't know the name. Anne, I don't know. Near 14th and 7th. A pause. Long enough to feel deliberate. Margaret, don't move. Anne's pulse spiked. She typed. Anne, you said we shouldn't meet. No dots. No response. Anne stared at the screen. Her chest tightened. She almost stood anyway. Then her phone vibrated. Margaret, I said we wouldn't meet like that. Anne swallowed. The distinction felt thin. The distinction felt everything. She typed. Anne, you shouldn't come. No response. Anne stared at the dark glass of her phone, reflection faint and warped. 5 minutes passed. 10. She told herself Margaret wasn't coming. She told herself this was a mistake. She told herself she should leave. She stayed. Headlights swept across the edge of the park. A black car pulled to the curb. Anne did not look at it. She didn't trust herself to. The door opened. Footsteps on pavement. Slow. Measured. They stopped a few feet away. Anne. Margaret's voice. Not the office version. Not the boardroom version. Lower. Unarmored. Anne closed her eyes. She didn't turn. I told you not to move, Margaret said. Anne's voice came out hoarse. I told you not to come. Margaret didn't argue. She stepped closer. Not touching. Not yet. The air between them felt dense. Anne finally turned. Margaret wasn't wearing her coat. Just the same dark sweater from earlier. Her hair slightly undone. She looked human, tired, controlled, holding herself together. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city filled the space. A siren somewhere far away. A bus exhaling. 2 people on a bench at the other end of the park laughing about something trivial. Life continuing. Anne broke first. You said you were protecting me. Margaret nodded. I am. Anne laughed softly. By taking everything away from me. Margaret's jaw tightened. By keeping you employable in 6 months. Anne shook her head. You don't get to frame my life as a spreadsheet. Margaret took a breath. I don't want to. Silence. Anne felt her throat burn. You didn't ask what I wanted, Anne said. You decided for me. Margaret's gaze held hers. I was trying to stop myself from wanting something I shouldn't. The admission landed quietly. Heavily. Anne's breath caught. Is that what this is? Anne asked. You managing your desire like it's a liability? Margaret didn't look away. Yes. Anne felt something inside her crack open. Not relief. Not victory. Truth. I'm not a mistake, Anne said. Margaret shook her head immediately. No, I'm not a threat. No, I'm not a weakness. Margaret hesitated. Just a fraction. Then, no. Anne stepped closer. The distance shrank. Not gone. Reduced. You don't get to want me and punish me for it, Anne said quietly. Margaret's eyes darkened. I'm not punishing you. You are controlling the outcome, Anne said. That feels the same on my end. Margaret closed her eyes for a brief second. When she opened them, something in her had shifted. Not collapsed. Not softened. Rearranged. You're right, Margaret said. Anne hadn't expected that. It landed strangely. What does that mean? Anne asked. It means I don't get to decide this alone, Margaret said. Anne swallowed. You said that to me earlier. Yes. And you didn't listen. Not I. Silence stretched. Not empty. You working. Margaret spoke again. The board is afraid of scandal, not of you, not of me, of headlines, fight you. Anne said nothing. I can fight that, Margaret continued. Quietly, slowly. Anne's chest tightened. At a cost, Anne said. Yes, to you, yes. Anne searched Margaret's face. Not for confidence. Not for dominance. For honesty. What do you want? Anne asked. Not professionally. Not hypothetically. Margaret answered without looking away. I want you in the succession track. Anne's pulse jumped. And? I want you trained by me. Anne's breath caught. And? Margaret hesitated. Just long enough to be human. I want to stop pretending I don't feel this. The words were not romantic. They were devastating. Anne felt heat behind her eyes. She did not cry. What does that look like? Anne asked. Margaret exhaled. It looks like risk. Anne nodded. It already is. Margaret stepped closer. Now they were standing within the same small orbit. Not touching. Not yet. If we do this, Margaret said, we don't hide behind euphemisms. We don't pretend it's only mentorship. And we don't let it become a rumor-shaped monster. Anne's heart hammered. So what do we do? Margaret's voice dropped. We're honest with each other. First. Anne swallowed. Does that honesty include the fact that I think about you when I'm alone? Margaret's breath hitched. Yes. Does it include the fact that I replay your voice in my head? Yes. Margaret's mouth curved slightly. Tends to blur, she said quietly. Anne felt a shaky laugh escape her. Then more serious, does it include the fact that I'm scared you'll decide one day that this was a mistake and erase me again? Margaret's gaze held hers. I can't promise I won't be afraid, Margaret said. I can promise I won't pretend you don't exist. Anne absorbed that. It wasn't perfect. It was real. Anne took one more step. Now their bodies were close enough to feel warmth. Still no contact. The restraint felt intentional. Alive. Anne lifted her hand. Stopped halfway. A silent question. Margaret looked at the hand, then at Anne's face. Then she nodded once. Anne's fingers touched Margaret's wrist. Lightly. Not possessive. Not claiming. Present. Margaret inhaled sharply. Neither of them moved. The city continued. A car door slammed. Someone laughed again. The world did not end. Anne felt something settle inside her. Not certainty. Not safety. Decision. We're going to get hurt, Anne said. Margaret's voice was steady. Probably. Anne nodded. Okay. It wasn't a vow. It wasn't a promise. It was a choice. Margaret turned her hands so their palms met. They did not interlace fingers. They simply rested together. Warm. Human. After a moment, Margaret spoke. I'll speak to the board tomorrow. Anne's heart stuttered. What will you say? That I'm resuming direct mentorship. That I take responsibility for the optics. That if they want me to step down, they can try. Anne stared at her. You'd risk your position. Margaret's gaze did not waver. Yes. Anne felt something in her chest unfold slowly. Not explosively. Like a long-closed window being opened an inch at a time. They stood like that for a while. Hands touching. No kiss. No rush. Just presence. Eventually, Margaret spoke. Come with me. Anne hesitated. Where? Not to my apartment, Margaret said immediately. Anne almost smiled. Good. Margaret's mouth curved faintly. My driver will take you home. Anne's chest tightened. And you? I'll walk for a bit. Anne studied her. Text me when you get there. Margaret nodded. They released each other's hands. The absence felt sharp, but survivable. Anne stepped back. Then, impulsively, she said, Margaret? Yes. Don't disappear again. Margaret's voice was quiet. I'm still here. Anne nodded. She turned, walked toward the car, didn't look back. Because this time, she didn't feel abandoned. She felt in motion. Later, lying in her bed, staring at the ceiling, Anne didn't replay the almost touch. She replayed the word okay. Not because it was romantic, but because it was chosen. Some risks don't arrive as explosions. They arrive as quiet agreements between two people who understand the cost and accept it anyway. What happens when the thing you're afraid of is also the thing that finally makes you honest?